The 80s kicked off with a major event in gaming, the release of Pac-Man. The colorful maze game appealed to a wide audience and even crossed over to the mainstream to become a worldwide phenomenon. Pac-Man was a leading character on the covers of game magazines dedicated to the video boom, but he also became the topic of a cartoon show and even pop music. Like Pac-Man itself, this was certainly a vibrant chapter in gaming. This era between the late 70s and early 80s is often referred to as the golden age in arcade gaming. Iconic titles hit the market at a rapid pace, breaking new ground and setting the first steps in new genres. A high demand within the market combined with a hype in youth culture made this a fruitful era for all parties involved. Companies with a history in the coin-op market, like Sega, Namco, Taito, and Williams, were among the big forces within the business. The 80s would bring them new opportunities and challenges as the industry was being formed. It would be a time of maturing, losing most of the Wild West spirit of the 70s and paving the road for a full-fledged industry. Pioneering remained key, but meanwhile, companies had to find sustainability in this dynamic industry. One of the major revolutions of the time involved the actual hardware. The first generation of arcade games were mostly using TTL boards. These consisted of countless transistors to hardwire the logics of a single specific game. As the 70s came to an end, a more flexible alternative quickly became the norm, the CPU. Microprocessors like the Zilog Z80 were making their impact in the computing industry. They became the heart of arcade boards to deal with the ever-growing complexity of games. With this came the first step in the separation between game programmer and arcade board development. A commonly used system among arcade programmers was the HP 64000, a pricey but robust and professional solution that would interface directly with the arcade board. They used it to write and compile their code and test it on the actual hardware. For debugging, they relied on an in-circuit emulator, a hardware kit that replaced and emulated the CPU of the arcade board. It was a hands-on approach to game development, writing code in low-level assembly language and directly interfacing the hardware. Drawing the in-game artwork still fell on the shoulders of the game director or programmer. Specialized pixel art tools were non-existent at this point. It was a process of drawing the artwork on grid paper first, then manually translating the image to hex values. The result was an array of numbers to define the color of each pixel within a small grid. The art of computer graphics was still in its infancy. Off-the-shelf paint tools were non-existent in 1980, and storing a color image demanded frame buffers worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Lacking these funds, arcade developers had to find clever solutions to draw the game screen using only a tiny bit of memory. One essential technique that was used industry-wide was splitting the artwork into tiny, repeatable tiles. Whole levels were constructed from a small set of building blocks. To further improve memory efficiency, they stored the on-screen colors in small sub-palettes. It was a great solution to still use a variety of colors with a very limited amount of data. This flexible system gave way to a range of colorful gaming mascots. Many of the arcade hits found their way, in some shape or form, to home consoles. It was still a booming market that attracted a number of companies new to the industry, trying to find success with their own home console.
This Philips video pack is so advanced, it's frightening.
A new business model was to publish games for these home systems as an independent developer. Activision was the first to apply this third-party developer business model for the Atari 2600. Their platform game Pitfall became a standout release in this console generation. Platformers and maze games were becoming a successful new formula in the console and arcade market. The already more established genres like racing and shooting games were also advancing rapidly, both in terms of graphics and gameplay. Konami released the side-scrolling shooters Scramble and Super Cobra. Namco further laid down the foundation of the modern shoot-'em-up in Xevious. Sega came with its own iteration, the isometric Zaxxon. Sega banked heavily on the video game arcade market, although they were still in a state of transition to this era of microprocessors, gaining knowledge in this field and attracting programmers. Like Nintendo, they outsourced development of a number of games to a specialized company in these days. Building on existing game concepts was not the only important trend of the early 80s. Companies were also experimenting with emerging technology and game design to find new ways of play. Atari, for instance, was breaking new ground with ambitious projects in the field of real-time 3D. Their games Battlezone and Star Wars displayed 3D imagery on a vector graphics display. Only a couple of years later, they were already using shaded polygons in the arcade game iRobot. As the number of games on the market quickly expanded, the industry was faced with a major challenge: market saturation. In 1983, games of yesterday like Pac-Man would often still outperform new releases, making it less of a priority for arcade owners to invest in new titles. Innovation was demanded to attract the interest of gamers and arcade owners, one example of which being the use of new technology like Laserdisc. Sega and Williams used Laserdisc technology to incorporate full-motion video in their games. All interactive elements were superimposed on these video clips. Laserdisc had the important property of being able to access any scene instantly without rewinding or loading. It was the perfect medium to set the next step in interactive storytelling and resulted in games like Dragon's Lair. The developers had teamed up with the animation studio of Don Bluth to bring the game concept and storyboards to life. The underlying game logic was quite simple, playing pre-made animation scenes according to the player's actions. But the feeling of being in control of a cartoon was quite the experience at its launch. For traditional animation studios, the gaming industry suddenly became a new market. The hype was ultimately short-lived, but certainly made its mark in arcades. As we now move on to the mid-80s, a more sustainable game concept became dominant: the side-scrollers. Initially, developers were using clever tricks to simulate scrolling playfields, but thanks to the increase in video RAM, boards were able to store 2 game screens and feature a scrolling function. Clever developers realized that this was enough to create a loop that kept updating the background seamlessly, making way for lengthy scrolling levels. Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins was one of the iconic side-scrollers to hit the market. It was also an early example of immersing the player in a fantasy setting. The graphic artist used various tricks to realize haunting environments, still being restricted to very few graphic assets. The pixel art had a textured quality, and thanks to the strong use of shading, the levels had a true sense of depth. Objects in the background were given a darker shade to add a sense of atmosphere, while also helping to visually make the characters stand out. Ghosts and Goblins was a true break from the flat-shaded and blocky look of older games. Drawing the pixel graphics was, at this point, starting to become a full-time profession, demanding the talents of traditionally trained artists. Companies were recruiting new talent with a background in art to make full use of the growing graphical capabilities. Another important event in the mid-80s was the new generation of iconic home consoles entering the market. While in the US the home consoles had quickly lost traction, in Japan the boom had just begun. Sega and Nintendo introduced their system with interchangeable cartridges in late '83. For Nintendo, it marked the birth of Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. Both games were designed by Nintendo's new development team, led by Donkey Kong's game designer Shigeru Miyamoto. Super Mario Bros. Offered the player an imaginative world filled with secrets and fun game mechanics. The colorful levels were a big improvement over the black backgrounds that dominated games on the system up until that point. Nintendo had already expanded to 4 divisions devoted to electronic gaming by the mid-80s. Among them was R&D 1, a group of developers who were responsible for the highly successful Game & Watch line. Nintendo's 2nd and 3rd divisions were involved in many hardware products like their consoles and developing chips to enhance their games. Miyamoto's R&D 4, on the other hand, was a small team solely focused on the artistic and gameplay aspects. Programming their game plans was outsourced to the external company, SRD, a fruitful partnership that lasted throughout the 80s. Together, they delivered a series of mega hits that left the arcade mentality behind and delivered a satisfying home experience. Nintendo greatly relied on external companies in these early years to strengthen their development teams. The transition to CPU-based games had happened so swiftly that many staff members still had to adapt. For many active in the game industry at the time, working in games was a job they had never anticipated. They'd started out in a creative or technical field that had subsequently landed them a job in this new industry. Many of them didn't have experiences with video games growing up. It was entertainment from their childhoods like cinema, TV, or comics that had formed their inspirations. The blend of creatives from different fields contributed to a creative synergy in the industry at this time. A new job within development teams in the mid-80s was that of the game composer. It was no longer sufficient for a programmer or director to create a few short jingles. Games were now demanding full soundtracks. Composing game music became a separate, specialized task, writing fitting tunes and creatively making the most of still very restrictive audio hardware. A synthesizer was a common instrument to compose the music, but implementing the tracks into the actual game was a technical process. Music was written in a coded format, each line describing the note, instrument, and length. In addition, a lot of musicians also programmed their own audio tools and drivers to take full control of the hardware. Over at the arcades, Sega's young mastermind Yu Suzuki helped to inject some new excitement into the scene. His broad range of interests in creative arts and motorsports contributed to a series of thrilling games. They offered a sense of immersion through interactive deluxe cabinets, an experience that couldn't be replicated on home consoles. The most 80s of all of his games was Outrun, which provided the player with a glimpse of the luxurious jet-set lifestyle. Outrun was a quantum leap in visual and audio spectacle compared to the games early in the decade. Thanks to the ever-dropping prices of computer chips, the game was powered by the next generation in processors. The 16-bit CPU made it possible to calculate the positions of large numbers of sprites. The advanced video circuit also housed some impressive features. It was not only able to display large numbers of sprites, but also store multiple background layers inside its video memory. Backgrounds could scroll individually to recreate a true parallax scrolling effect. Another major improvement was the sheer number of colors, allowing the artists to create lush scenery with sweeping sunsets. With in-game graphics rapidly becoming more sophisticated, companies began to rely on their in-house developed art tools. Some were initially used to digitize graphics drawn on grid paper, but they quickly became the central kit in the artist's pipeline. Sega had developed a system called Digitizer, a combination of custom hardware and software. It housed 2 monitors, one for displaying the user interface and the other the final composite. The first iteration of the system worked with ROMs as storage media. It was therefore a costly endeavor to save progress, as these chips could be burned just once. It was a sign of the still hands-on approach to arcade development, swapping ROMs directly on the actual board to update a graphics set. Within a few years, a more file-based approach quickly spread. Floppy disk drives were added to the digitizer. Having to work for hours without saving was therefore a thing of the past. Each company had their own pixel paint tools, some running on custom hardware, others on PCs of that era. The input devices ranged from light pens to keyboards to joysticks, but what the tools all had in common was their focus on game development, taking into account palettes and tile sizes and specific limitations. But it was not only the cutting edge that characterized the production pipeline. Pencil and paper had still retained its importance. Having access to a computer with a graphical interface was not yet the norm for game designers. Paper remained the most intuitive way for sketching level layouts or communicating all kinds of details to programmers. For instance, providing context to the tile sets by describing how to construct specific animation frames. A major revolution in the 80s was the massive popularity of home computers. Thanks to dropping prices and rapid technical advancements, they found their way into many homes and workplaces. These systems were also of undeniable importance to the gaming industry. They were a whole new entry point to video game development. Hudson Soft, Falcom, and Technosoft were even computer shops before they actually began creating games. With small funds, they embarked on their adventure to make it in the industry. Storage formats like cassette tapes and discs were ideal for putting their games on the market in low quantities and with limited financial risks. The home computer boom resulted in a rapid growth of game studios around the world. Home computers were also the perfect platform for young aspiring developers, programming their first games, sending them off to an established company, or even getting their games in stores through a publisher. All these new computer games would also enrich the video game market. Numerous popular titles were ported over to consoles. Computer games like Wizardry would even become highly influential to the Japanese RPG trend that was about to start. For Konami, home computers were a key market during the 80s, being the home of important franchises. Due to their older demographic, the Konami computer team experimented with deeper game concepts. Their output had a significant adventure flavor compared to their console and arcade divisions. The mid-80s was a time in which the importance of personal and home computers further expanded. They all offered a range of creative tools for hobbyists and professionals. Among the tools was EA's Deluxe Paint for the Amiga, hitting the market late 1985. An all-rounder paint application with animation functions as well, Deluxe Paint would grow to become a standard for Western game developers. Use of more powerful computers on the market was quickly spreading throughout the whole production pipeline. The latest systems from NEC and Sharp were put to use for writing game code, music, or drawing graphics. Thanks to these machines, the bar to entry for game development had significantly lowered. Consoles also further grew in their industry importance. Divisions within the bigger developers that catered to the home market were rising in stature. Sega's consumer division was largely responsible for providing their console with a library of games. They had to deal with short turnarounds, sometimes having to finish a project in just 2 months. Porting arcade hits was still of key importance, but they were equally adding to the overall gaming palette with their own unique games. Phantasy Star and Alex Kidd became icons in their own right. They were just 2 among countless new franchises to have their start in these couple of years. Several daring smaller studios were also starting to be attracted to console development. It was a much more closed-off market, having to pay royalties and deal with strict regulations, among which being forced to order cartridges through the console manufacturers at a high price and complying with their scheduling. In return, the developers could ride on the popularity and marketing of these systems and focus their main business on the software side. The basic workflow for a programmer was quite similar to arcade development. They would write and compile their code on a PC and transfer it to a RAM cartridge inside the console. An in-circuit emulator remained essential for debugging, allowing the user to step through the code and inspect memory and registers. During the early years of Famicom's lifespan, official dev kits were non-existent. Developers like Namco had reverse-engineered the console themselves and constructed their own development environment. Even in the late 80s, this remained a common practice for studios to test the waters. It was still the era of writing your own tools, and console development was no exception. Going beyond the basic documentation and the provided drivers was essential to boost performance. Some programmers were already taking advantage of exploits to implement all kinds of effects. The high-quality output of third parties became a huge asset to Nintendo and an essential business model in the industry. Even outside of Japan, studios like Rare were embracing this generation of consoles. It was the first sign of Western studios entering the console market again. Packaging art was highly influential for consumers to judge a game at the moment of purchase. Many boxes featured characters in captivating environments, taking cues from contemporary movie posters or fantasy and sci-fi art. These were all still painted by hand. Companies often had their own art teams, but hiring freelance illustrators was also common practice. Nintendo, as a major force in the industry, was able to use all marketing channels to their full potential. Through in-store branding, they controlled how their products were displayed at retail. Their logo and mascots were becoming visually recognizable icons for kids. It was a time of professionalizing their marketing teams, not least for making sure their iconic characters had a consistent look in all published media and merchandise. Contemporary entertainment also had its influence over gaming. Marketing departments had their eyes on acquiring licenses to the hottest new properties. When teamed up with a top-class development team, these could result in quality releases. They expanded the TV experience for kids by giving them the chance to take full control of their heroes. In this period of immersive game settings, movies were a rich source of inspiration. The vibrant 80s pop culture helped to shape many video game heroes and villains. The action heroes, sci-fi themes, and revenge movies were some of the trends to cross over to video gaming. It was natural that gaming was shaped by the contemporary trends and the popular aesthetics of the time. The late 80s arcade hits from Capcom, Konami, and Sega drew from pop culture, but also displayed the absolute best in visual spectacle. These companies were using their in-house developed arcade boards that ran a series of games. This greatly streamlined development and cut costs in a competitive market. It also made it more advantageous for arcade owners, as they could order new games at a reduced price. The latest iteration of the arcade boards were powered by 16-bit processors and featured advanced graphical circuits. A new, impressive hardware feature was the real-time scaling and rotation of backgrounds. The boards could also define thousands of colors. Pixel artists could therefore use different shades that they weren't able to use before, opening the way for a more gritty style, or the complete opposite, combining pastels with highly saturated colors. Drawing pixel graphics was becoming a true art form. The skills of the individual artists were at least equally important to the system's capabilities. In the final years of the 80s, Japan was already transitioning to the next generation of game consoles. NEC introduced the PC Engine, a system that featured a CD-ROM add-on as early as 1988. Sega launched their powerhouse, the Mega Drive, that same year, a stylish piece of hardware taking cues from hi-fi equipment with a touch of automotive design, bringing their 16-bit arcade icons into homes. In this new era of gaming, development teams were further expanding, demanding multiple programmers and designers to work on a game. A whole new generation of developers were attracted to fill the growing number of job openings. Some were avid gamers, inspired by hits like Xevious and Space Harrier to enter the industry themselves. Thanks to the home computers, they'd already been able to hone their development skills. The overall workflow of game development had been well established by this point. Typical dev kits consisted of a console, a RAM cartridge, and an in-circuit emulator. When that was all hooked up, the programmers could run and test their code on the console's hardware. Knowledge of popular CPUs was also becoming widespread in the industry. What remained was to learn all the quirks of a given system and exploit certain features to create impressive effects. As artists became well-versed in drawing pixel art, innovation in other areas also continued. Namco was working to bring their racing legacy to the world of 3D polygonal graphics. With the help of the Japan Computer Graphics Lab, they were able to realize the highly complex project Winning Run. It turned out to be a major milestone in a new generation of arcade racers. Game developers had also begun to experiment with different techniques to create graphics. The creator of Prince of Persia used live-action footage as a guide to realize fluid character animations. Williams had begun to experiment with digitizing filmed footage. A robust solution had just entered the market in the form of Targa, high-color graphic boards for the PC market that could directly digitize images from analog feeds coming from a video camera or tape deck. It was just the start of exploring new techniques to create impactful gaming graphics. With these rapid technical advancements, the industry was already transitioning to a new chapter by the end of the 80s. The introduction of 16-bit consoles, new steps in polygonal graphics and digitization paved the path for the following years. Video gaming had proven to not just be a short-lived fad of the 70s. The industry, once dominated by arcade manufacturers, had greatly expanded. Console and computer games became sustainable markets in their own right, providing an opportunity for countless new studios to enter this dynamic market. For the young gaming enthusiast, it had been a colorful era, enjoying the wide selection of brand new franchises, all still sharing a sense of innocence through their bright pixel graphics. Video games so nicely complemented the other colorful trends in youth entertainment within this vibrant decade.